Thanks, Ron. So I thank the organizers for inviting me for this meeting, and hopefully I can provide you with some information that's relevant to your area. So why do we need some heat training adaptation? The first slide I want to show is a slide which I really like because it provides us data of body temperature distribution in a group of athletes in a cool environment. And what we have here is in the body core temperature measured by a group in Nijmegen in the Netherlands in a 15-kilometer run. We've got core temperature distribution here before the race, and here at the end of the race. And even though it's a cool environment, what we see is 15% of the people is already above 40 degrees Celsius. So that gives an indication of how important temperature regulation is and what the risk is if we move this type of race to a hot environment. So if you go to the heat, either you have to reduce your performance, you have to slow down to keep your body temperature within safe limits, or obviously you increase your risk. And reducing that risk, the main way we can do that, and I think it's one of the best proven ways of adapting to a stressor, is by acclimatizing people to heat. So there's a lot of classic literature on this topic, and this is one of the classic ones, Eichner 1950, showing a heat acclimation regime over 10 days of heat exposure. And what you see here is we got the control condition, and all the thick black dots are before the start of the exercise. And on each day you see an exercise where the body temperature, so heart rate here, rectal temperature here, and mean skin temperature. So you see them all go up during each test in all conditions. But the main thing you see here is with each repeated exposure, you see that the overall N values that are connected up with this line here are coming down. So that means we expose the people to the same stress every day, and slowly their strain is reducing. And of course, in the light of the previous slide, that's a very important way of adapting. And I think one of the things that, if you compare all kinds of adaptations, I think very few people would doubt the benefit of heat acclimatization before training or exercising in the heat. So very quickly, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, difference between acclimatization and acclamation. Acclimatization being the natural process if you move somewhere, if you go and live somewhere, whereas we talk about acclimation if we're experimentally induced this. Now, given that most athletes don't have the time to go to a different place, a hot place, before their race for a couple of weeks beforehand, in most of the situation we will talk about an acclimation to heat in order to prepare them. And of course, all the lab studies would fall under acclimation. So we'll try to stick with acclimation as the word to be used. So again, benefits, we have lower strain, and this again is another classical example. A lot of the studies on heat acclimation were done around the Second World War with soldiers who had to go, of course, to Northern Africa, etc., in the war, and those studies were continued. And again, an illustration here. These are incidents of heat syncope in 45 men walking in the heat, 49 degrees Celsius, 20% relative humidity. And so the incidence on the 45 people on the first day, 20 out of 45 showed syncope. And that was reduced, and after 5 days, all of them were able to complete the exercise. So in terms of the changes the body has, I already showed some in the previous slide. The main ones are shown here, but it's a long list, and there's a couple of very good reviews in the last couple of years. Nigel Taylor did one in Comprehensive Physiology, and this is a different one by Sorka recently in the Gatorade magazine. Core temperature is reduced. So when you go and exercise, you will exercise with the same workload and the same client with a lower core temperature, or you can push up your workload and get the same core temperature. Sweating is improved, skin temperature is reduced, and heart rate is lowered. But as you see here, the list of changes, and this is even more, is very long. So there's lots of different things which change, but the ones that I circled here are, I would say, the most classical representations of heat acclimation. So if we look at a couple of the main ones here, and this is some slides which come from a modeling paper, a thermophysiological modeling paper that I did quite a while ago, where I reviewed the literature to see whether we could look at the control equations of skin blood flow and sweat rate in relation to body core temperature and skin temperature. And this is a very schematic drawing, of course. So what I've drawn here is core temperature on the horizontal axis, skin blood flow in the vertical axis. And this is based on probably a summary of about 40 papers which reported changes in threshold, body core temperature threshold for sweating, changes in the gain of sweating, so or skin flow in this case, so the slope between skin blood flow and core temperature. So the general picture here is if we are unfit, we have a low maximum skin blood flow, we have a threshold value here. With increasing training, we shift the threshold to the left, and if we, in the end, add acclimation to the training, of course you could do that with the unfit as well, but let's say we do it with a fit athlete, what we see is a threshold shift here. It seems that the slope of the curve stays the same. Of course, there's some variation in the literature, but that was the overall picture. And you raise your maximum skin blood flow. So, of course, that's a very important adaptation for you to, in the heat, to transport your heat from your muscles to your core and then to the skin where you can release the body heat from your body. If we look at the similar slide schematically for sweat rate, that looks slightly different. So again, when you are unfit and you start to train, your threshold for sweating shifts to a lower level. Your gain of sweating, so the amount of sweat you increase per degree increase in core temperature, starts to increase with fitness levels. And if you then add acclimation as well, that even further increases the gain and further reduces the threshold. So these are the main reasons why if you heat acclimate somebody, that you will find that they will have a lower body core temperature at rest and a changed response during the exercise. So in terms of acclimatization or acclimation regimes, there's two main ones in the literature. And they were both described quite a long time ago. There's lots of work on this, for example, by Fox in the 1960s. So the most common one, you have a constant stress. So every day you put the person in the same climate with the same workload, etc. And what you will see, as you saw on one of the first slides, is that the strain over time will get down. So the body temperature will not increase to the same level if you're continuing this. The alternative is to increase the stress day by day, because if on the second day and the third day you have a lower core temperature, so the idea is that you then push up either the workload or the stress by the climate, temperature or humidity, and thereby each day recreate the same body core temperature profile. So because body core temperature is one of the important triggers for acclimation, pushing up the core temperature each time to that level is therefore important. And that is a much more efficient and much more successful regime to get maximum acclimation. So just to illustrate this is the classical pattern of constant stress. So these are data from Windham in South Africa, where again a lot of the traditional work on acclimation is done, and I encourage especially young people to look at that classical work, because I see a lot of citations to recent work where they're forgetting that a lot of the stuff has been done already. So what we have here is rectal temperature over time, 16 days here, and like in the first slide, you see a reduction of core temperature with an advancing acclimation. Sweat rate increases with advancing acclimation, and heart rate is reduced. But of course, if you look at core temperature as a stimulus for acclimation, the stimulus is high here, but the stimulus will be lower and lower, which means that the efficiency of the process is not as good as in the alternative. And this is an example of an alternative alternative method where we have constant strain. So this is time, 45 degrees Celsius, 20% humidity, 1 meter per second wind speed. And you see this is day 1 and day 6 of an acclimation regime. And on both days and all the days in between, we recreated the same profile of body core temperature, which means the stimulus to the system stays the same, and therefore is a stronger stimulus to get the adaptation. Important with acclimation, if you plan acclimation, it's specific. So it's specific to both the climate and the workload. And that means that for an athlete, it's really important to consider to acclimate to the real conditions of the event. Yeah, so because the various changes or differences in responses. You have to look at whether you have to acclimatize or acclimate specifically to a hot, dry versus a warm, humid climate, because they induce slightly different responses in the body. Although there is some evidence, or quite a bit of evidence, that there is crossover from one to the other. But if you go and exercise in a warm, humid environment, a hot, dry acclimation will not give you the maximum benefits. And there's some suggestion in the literature that possibly if you have the time for it, because that's of course often the critical point, you could do a hot, dry first which would mainly be triggering your sweat system and your cardiovascular system. And the last couple of days, let's say of a 2-week regime, typically you need at least 8 plus days, 8 days to 2 weeks to get the full benefit. In the last couple of days, you would then switch to a humid climate, which would then add to what you already have here and focus then more on fluid regulation, because your sweating is not that effective in a warm, humid climate because you don't evaporate the moisture. So here you are more reliant on fluid regulation and cardiovascular adaptations. So acclimation is specific. It's specific to the intensity, and that's both the intensity of the climate, air temperature, vapor pressure, radiation levels, and wind, as well as on the workload. So again, for the athlete, replicating your actual race conditions will have to look into both workload and the climate. It's related to the duration, how much time can you spend in each session on each day, and how many days will you keep up with it. And like I said, 6 days will give you, most people will give you a reasonable level of acclimation, but 2 weeks is probably what you need to get the full effect. Whereas short interruptions seem to be not a big problem. But of course, if you're doing a study on this topic in your lab, you may want to consider working through the weekend. Training is also related to acclimation. So when you are training and exercise a lot, especially if you're not very well trained to start with, the training per se will already give you partial acclimation, which is illustrated in this slide from Cohen and Gisolvi, again, quite older data. What we have here is a 4-hour test, and as you see, the dots stop here, so they didn't manage to get past the first hour in this test. Rectal temperature and heart rate on the first pre-training session. Then they had a series of training sessions, so purely exercise training, no heat. And what you see an improvement here, which is what you possibly would expect, is because they were not fully trained people, so the training has an impact here. But training, of course, pushes up your body temperature each time and therefore also stimulates in part your acclimation. And then when they added a hot-dry training plus acclimation regime, you see then rectal temperature has come down quite a lot and people are actually able to fulfill the 4-hour requirements of the test here. So training is partial acclimation. So trained athletes acclimate faster. That may be linked to that they're already partially acclimated. So that's one of the factors. And they seem to retain it longer after the end of the acclimation period. In terms of the stimuli, it seems that you need both increases in core and in skin temperature. And there's a number of studies which looked at this. For example, again, old study, Avellini, and there's some repeats of those in the literature as well later on. Training in cool water, where you keep core temperature stable and skin temperature low, no acclimation was found. Training in warm water, they did find acclimation. And at the bottom, training in a cool airflow, so that's a higher core temperature but with a low skin temperature, no acclimation was observed. Recently, people have been looking at alternative methods for acclimation, and there's quite a bit of interest in that. So we have a recent paper from Neil Walsh's group, I think, in looking at hot baths after exercise. So rather than sticking people in a cold bath that we often do, put them in a hot bath after the exercise, and they found a clear acclimation effect after 6 days of hot baths. Sauna exposure after exercise, 31 minutes in the sauna, 89 degrees. Now 31 minutes and 89 degrees is actually quite a long time, so that's why I put the exclamation marks there. So I'm not sure whether that's the ideal way of doing it for athletes. But they also found an improvement. And I'll come back to that later. They also found an improvement for exercise in a cool environment based on this study. And then there's lots of people that use sauna suits, either with passive heating, where they found an effect, but in terms of protective clothing, not that important for you, but if you think about industrial work, there's also some negative acclimation results when people had to work a lot and try to acclimatize or acclimate in impermeable clothing. This slide is just to illustrate sweat losses. I already mentioned sweat losses increase between two conditions. Gonzalez, 1974, and there's many, virtually all the studies are show clearly the same thing. The only extra thing they did here is they started to increase relative humidity in the environment, which means the skin gets wetter and wetter, and when the skin gets very wet, it starts to, most likely the reason, to block down the sweat duct and thereby reduces sweating. And the important thing here is, although the sweating is reduced, both pre and post acclimation, the differences between the two is still there, so it still has a benefit even if it gets very humid. A very important factor in acclimation is electrolyte loss. So if you look at sweat rates and look at the content, electrolyte content, that you will see that there's quite a dramatic reduction in sodium content in this case, less than half of the sodium content. So you increase sweating. So if we start with unacclimated, you have a high sweat rate, high sodium content, which gives you a very high sodium loss with issues if you do that for a long time. With acclimation, you push up your sweat rates, but you lower sodium usually more than you increase sweat rate. So overall, you have a reduced sodium loss. And this sodium retention may be one of the reasons that allows you to have a higher body water level that I'll come back to later, and retain your plasma volume. So body water, so plasma volume is often considered one of the factors which could benefit you in your sports performance, of course in the heat, but maybe also in the cold, in a cool environment, as I will talk about in a minute. So this is a study by Patterson in 2003, and again, it's just an example of a number of these studies that have shown this. What we see here is that total body water, this is a constant strain, 90 minutes, 40 degrees Celsius, 6% relative humidity, 70 days acclimation protocol, and after the protocol, and they measured at 8 days, so that's these bars, and at 22 days, you see a significant increase in total body water, significant increase in plasma volume, and for the moment, no change in red cell volume that I'll come back to later. So this increase in plasma volume would give you a higher cardiovascular stability and would be very important for your performance in the heat. Heat shock proteins, I won't go to that in depth, but in general, heat shock proteins increase with acclimation. And in general, the idea is that heat shock proteins increases survival chance of subsequent otherwise lethal exposures. So it's a protective mechanism if then in your race you would have a very extreme condition and you would overdo things, that you would have a certain level of protection that you didn't have before. Another area is redistribution of regional sweat rates. So one of the ideas, classical descriptions of heat acclimation is that the sweat, so this is data from Caroline Smith, who did her PhD on this. So this is body sweat distribution in a normal, moderate climate exercise at 70% VO2 max, and you see the front here, the back of the person. You see the highest sweat rates here along the spine, forehead, of course. But in general, you see the trunk has a higher sweat rate than the extremities. And suggestion already by Candace in the early 1970s was that in heat acclimation, you would get a redistribution of sweat from the trunk towards the limbs, which then would give you a better distribution of the sweat and a higher efficiency of the sweat evaporation. So more cooling for the similar amount of sweat. Caroline also did a heat acclimation study. And 6 days heat acclimation, I showed you the slide before. In terms of before and after acclimation, absolute data, so test at 50% VO2 max and at 70% VO2 max. Absolute data means, is there a change by acclimation? Yes, there is a change by acclimation, as you see quite clearly in both work levels. But then she normalized the data, so she divided all the numbers for each region by the average value for the whole body, which means then you look at patterns rather than absolute values. And what we did find there is that indeed on the upper back and the medium and the lateral upper back, there was some reduction. So not a reduction in sweat rate, but a reduction in relative sweat rate to the mean of the body. And on the arms, we saw an increase, which would suggest there's a little bit of this effect going on of redistribution. But other studies, for example, this case, Patterson in 2003, who looked at local sweat rates before and after acclimation. And I would just like to, so local sweat rate on this axis, I would just like to focus here on these two, the chest and the forearm, where you see, again, over 8 and 22 days of acclimation, an increase in the chest or sweating of 73%. So this is in sweat capsules, so just a very small surface area, whereas in the previous one it was quite large surface areas. And in the forearm, 81%. And based on this, they concluded that there would not be a clear redistribution. Now, we did measure the back, so that would be equivalent here to the scapula, and you see there's a bit more difference over there. But overall, I would say there's limited evidence of sweat redistribution to the extremities, but that might need some more work. So one of the things that has become quite a topic lately is the ergogenic effect of acclimation for exercise in a cool environment. And there's a number of studies there. This one is from Chris Minson's lab by Lorenzo et al. I showed you the one by Schoon with the sauna, and Becky Neal, who's here as well, I think, has done some studies on this as well. And those were the 3 studies that actually did find a beneficial effect of heat acclimation on exercise in a moderate or cool environment. So what we have on this slide is the data from Lorenzo. So they had a heat acclimation group and a control group, and they did match the training levels, because virtually this topic is almost very similar to what the issues you have with hypoxic training, and look at how the improvements are with hypoxia. There's lots of issues if you're not careful. So they try to match the training levels of the control group and the heat acclimation group. And what you see here is the control group didn't have any significant changes, but in the heat acclimation group, they did see a change in VO2 max in the conditions in a hot climate, 38 degrees, as well as in a cool climate, 13 degrees. And that was very strongly matched or very strongly linked for the individuals to the time trial performance. So this suggests a very clear benefit of heat acclimation on exercise in a moderate climate. Other studies, like the one with the sauna, very often find a very strong relationship between performance and plasma volume expansion. So that's one of the issues, one of the explanations there. So if we look at these studies as far as they are, and if you look at the Journal of Physiology, there has been like a counterpoint, but named slightly different discussion between Lars Nibo, who says there is no such thing, and Chris Minson and Jim Cotter on the other side, who says there is such a thing based on the data I just showed you. So, question, of course, what would be the mechanism for the cool environment? One suggestion is erythropoiesis, so more blood cells. So what you did see here is plasma volume expansion in the previous slides, but you did see the same red cell blood volume, which should in principle mean the body should have produced more red cells, so that could be something, but it's quite speculative. Most people suggest increased body water and plasma volume improves the VO2 max, and therefore that definitely is the case in the heat, but could also have an impact in the cool environment. But the counterpoint to that is that acute plasma volume expansion, which is done in a number of studies by Kanstrup, had no effect in trained people. So if that would be the effect of heat acclimation, you would expect something there. It was mentioned that hemodilution, which happens with acute plasma volume expansion, would counteract increased stroke volume and cardiac output that you get by the cardiovascular stability achieved. So one effect would take away the other. But if you would do a full acclimation process, you may not have the hemodilution as it's happening with the acute plasma volume expansion. Endurance athletes already have a higher plasma volume, so that means the impact for them may be less. So a lot of these studies were done with sub-elite athletes, so that could be different from your elite athlete. People found moderate benefits in untrained, so I think that's a general observation. And several other studies have shown no effect in a cool environment. But I should say that some of them have quite low statistical power, and there's also the issue with responders and non-responders. And looking at some of the data going through the various papers for this talk, I did notice that a lot of people unfortunately don't report what they just say the control group was not significant, but they don't say whether that was 0.06 or 0.5 in terms of p-value. So if you have a lot of non-responders in your group, that may be an issue there in sensitivity, and I would almost think that an approach like Hopkins used with his approach, it does have a negative effect. Might it have a positive effect in some people, would be worth to look at here. And similar to with hypoxic training, there is the issue with maintaining training load in the heat. So in future, I'm sure there's lots of studies will follow this work, and they will have to be very, very careful whether they can match the training loads in the different conditions. Very quickly, you will lose acclimation. Typical standard numbers are in 2 to 3 weeks. You've lost most of your acclimation. Different for rectal temperature, heart rate, and sweat rate, but 2 to 3 weeks later is very little left of the benefit. But if you're an athlete, if you can go to the hot place within a week, week and a half, re-acclimatization happens quite quickly, within 2 days. And there is some interesting data that has come out recently where Daan et al. In the Netherlands looked at heat acclimation, and they did find the usual effects of heat acclimation, but then they retested people 3, 7, and 18 days later, and they found an extra benefit, so an even lower body core temperature in the heat stress test after, I think, about 18 days. So there's no explanation for that. It conflicts with all the classical data, so I think, again, that needs further study. So it's almost like there is in certain way of an extra effect after the end of the procedure. So, given the time, I'll only go through this very briefly. This is a summary which you can find in a NATO document from the Human Factors in Medicine panel. They came up with a summary statement, mainly for the application in the military world, but also for athletic exposures. And Sorka summarized that as well in, I think it's in Sports Science Exchange. So the main thing is start early. Be ready for it, start early, don't wait until the last week before you go if you have to prepare for it. Mimic the competition climate and exercise tasks, so don't try to acclimatize to something much worse than your real climate. Target the actual situation where you're going to. Ensure adequate heat stress in your procedure, so make sure you really get that body temperature up, because if you just sit there and just sit in the heat, your body temperature will not go up. So the stimulus really is a high body temperature, ideal above 38.5 for as long as possible during, let's say, 1.5 to 2 hours of your exposure. Make sure you recover properly, so that not the next day your recovery is not full and you go downhill rather than uphill. And given the loss of electrolytes, etc., during your heat acclimation regime, there's a real importance of drinking and eating adequately. So, like I say, all the detailed advice here you can find in Sorka's summary as well. Thank you very much.